Hey, in this tutorial we will be building three materials this time, and as you can see we've got a candle, so we're going to be creating the wax for the candle. We're also going to be creating a wick, and we will be creating the flame as well, and we're going to be doing this all procedurally. So we'll be doing it with shaders and perhaps a few other objects to help us along the way. Now I'm going to aim for a candle at night so that the main source of illumination is the flame itself. So we're going to need to add some lights into here, but if I render, you can see that I'm using some GI, and that's just to give us a kind of a global blue light. You don't really need to do that. You could just set a light in there, very low level, with an ambient blue color. But just to get this really quick GI effect, I'll just show you how I've done that. In the global illumination, I've set this to use a radiance cache. Now I'm using release 15, but this will still work in older versions. And just so that it renders really fast, under the radiance cache options, I've set the record density to be -6, -6. So in other words, really chunky and big and low res. Now I wouldn't recommend this for anything other than previews, wouldn't use it for animation or anything like that, because you're going to get extreme flickering, but it allows you to render GI blisteringly fast, and we can use that in combination with our lights. I just think that small amount of blue light in the scene makes it look a little bit nighttime, and we can then see the shadow that's cast from our light and things like that. So the first thing what I'm going to do before I add any shaders into this scene is I'm going to add in a light, and let's grab this light and pull this up to where our wick is. Now because we are going to be using the flame for most of our illumination, we're going to want these lights to cast shadows, and at the moment this looks like it's kind of inside the wick, but we can adjust that a little bit later if need be. I'm going to set the shadow type to be area, and then if we just switch to our side view, let's rotate that around so that the area shadow is kind of pointing down. Switch to the details tab, and I think what we want to do here is set the size really small so that the shadows are pretty hard, but they will have a tiny amount of fall off. The other thing that's really important with lights, especially in a situation like this, is to use fall off so that the light falls off naturally over a certain distance. If we don't enable fall off, then that light will basically emit for an infinite distance, and it's just not accurate. So if we come down to the fall off option and let's enable inverse square, physically accurate, and let's set that to be a really small amount, say 25. Now let's render and have a look, and we should just have a little ball of light right there. So this is going to almost act like the immediate illumination from our from the flame. You notice there's a few little artifacts and stuff on here, and that's from the GI, but don't worry about that, because we can up those settings when we do our final render. So I'm just going to call this small light. Let me just render that one more time, because I just want to have a look at the shadow that's being created, and you can see that we're not really seeing any shadow on the floor. It's either really huge or non-existent. So I'm going to take this light and I'm going to duplicate it and call this top light. And I'm going to cheat with this light, and first of all what I'm going to do is I'm going to just move it up so it's high, up above. So like, let's have a look, something like so. So it's like 280, let's say 285 above. Under the details tab, I'm going to make the area size smaller so we get an even harder shadow. Fall off I'm going to set to inverse square clamped. Now the difference between the physically accurate and the clamped one is the clamped, inverse square clamped will clamp the brightness so you don't get really over bright areas that you do with the physically accurate one. But on this I'm going to set the radius decay to like 250. Now if we come back to our perspective view and let's just render and have a look. Okay, and there we go. And so you can see we're getting a lot of light hitting the top, and we've got this really nice shadow as well, as if the flame itself has created that. So now we've got some lights in place, we should start building our materials, and these lights might need a little bit of tweaking. And if we were building a really big scene and this was just a part of it, then we would probably take these lights and under the project tab we would set them to include only perhaps this candle and the surface that it's sitting on. It depends, because we're using fall off, then we probably don't need to do that, because the lights would influence all the other objects around. It really depends on the type of scene that you're working on. Let's come down to the material manager, double click, and let's create our candle wax first of all. So create a material, call it candle wax, and let's drag and drop this onto the candle SDS object. Before we start creating our material, it's a good idea to have a look at some reference. So I've got a few candle images here that I've found in Google. If we just have a look through these, and you can see that we do get this very bright hot spot, and we get the light bleeding through the surface. And there's some really great examples here. And you can see also that it does have some quite sharp reflective or specular properties as well. And you can see that also on here. And if you notice, the surface itself has some indents and it's not perfect by any stretch. But the beautiful thing about it is the way that the colour goes through the surface, and we can achieve that with subsurface scattering. Now we'll also be creating the flame, and we'll also be texturing the wick. And as you can see with this wick, so we've got a little bit of white, we've got the charred area, and then we've got the glowing part at the end. And the flames themselves all have a very similar characteristic. They're pretty much pure white, and they just go to this orange and red at the tip and around the edges, and they almost have like a transparent part where they're over the top of the wick itself. And you can see that here. So there's definitely some similarities between all of these. On here you see we get a slight sort of blue colour at the bottom of the flame, and there's another example with the wick with the glowing end. So probably the most important parameter that we need to set up is our subsurface scattering. So let's just select this new material. Under the color tab, I'm going to set this to be a kind of, you know, like a classic wax color. So it's almost like a church candle. So it's sort of yellowy orange, something like so, just for the actual diffuse color. Let's come back to the basic tab, enable luminance. Under the luminance, let's choose texture, effects, and add in subsurface scattering. Just going to render this so we can see what it looks like, and you can see already it's getting that kind of subsurface glow. The light is traveling inside the object. Not looking very waxy at the moment though. Now, as I say, I want to create this with that kind of church candle feel. And if you notice from those images that I showed you, you start off with a kind of a yellowy colour, and it almost goes through to a much richer, deeper orangey red. So for the base colour in luminance, I'm going to pick somewhere, something around there. And then let's just pick a kind of orangey, almost like a peachy colour. Now we can't see any effect of that colour at the moment because we've got our subsurface scattering, but we can set the mix mode to multiply, and it will multiply the colour within our subsurface scattering shader with the colour that we specify in luminance. And one of the really cool things about this, if I just render, you can see that colour starting to work. But we can actually set the brightness of this colour above 100. So let's be just crazy and set that to 200. And you can see that now we're getting this amazing glow. And if we render this now, look at the result, and you can see it's already starting to take on the kind of the correct characteristics for a candle. Now we don't really want that to be so high, so let's set that to say 130, something like so. Let's open up our subsurface scattering shader, because this is where all the magic happens. The first thing we should do is probably set the color, and I'm going to set this to be, again, a kind of orangey brown color, something like so. Maybe a bit more yellow. I think something like that is pretty good. And we can increase the strength here, so we're basically increasing the strength of that color in our subsurface scattering effect. And I'm going to set this really high, say 250. We can also bring in shaders, etc., into here to kind of influence that. So if we want more than one color within our subsurface effect, but I'm going to leave that for now. Next, we've got path length, and this is pretty important. This is the how long or how deep into the object the subsurface effect will travel. Now, there are a few different ways that subsurface scattering works, and by default, it's set to use mode cache. We also have the direct mode, which is a bit more like QMC. And depending on how low you set your path length will really depend on which one you want to choose. And also, if you are bringing in shaders and stuff into here and you want a really accurate definition from the colors and the patterns, then using direct mode will probably give you a more accurate result. The problem with using the direct mode is that it is quite noisy, so you have to set the number of samples fairly high, and as you do that, obviously your rendering times increase. However, with cache, things can be fairly quick, but as soon as you start to set your path length really low, then everything slows right down. And I'll give you an example. If I set this path length to 25 and we render, you can see that the whole thing renders in, look at this, here we go, 4 seconds. If we set this down to 5, and now let's render, and you can see it's preparing subsurface caches, still pretty fast. 6, so that's fairly good. Let's set this down to 1 and have a look what happens. Preparing subsurface caches. Preparing subsurface caches. Okay, so it took nearly 8 seconds to prepare the caches, and you know, you can see that it's traveling less distance in. We're getting a pretty nice result, but now it's 15 seconds. So we went from 5 seconds to 15 seconds. If I set this down to like 0.25 or something really low like that and hit render, you know, we're going to be waiting a fair amount of time. Okay, I paused that there, but it wasn't quite as bad as I thought it was going to be at 18 seconds. So it's still 3 times slower than it was with a path length of like 20, 25. At a certain point, you're going to find that this becomes incredibly slow, especially if you're using sub-polygon displacement or even regular displacement, and you've got like a complex model, or your lighting setup is fairly complex, in which case it's definitely worth trying the direct mode, and things may actually be faster than using the cache mode. So it really depends on every scene and the lighting setup. So that's just worth bearing in mind. I'm going to set this path length back to be 5. So what else can we do to speed things up? Directly below the mode option, we have this fast evaluation, and fast evaluation will quite often speed up the calculations. Let's have a look at sample density first of all, because this is a really good way of speeding things up. If we set this down to a very low value, what will happen is the number of samples will be less dense. In other words, it won't sample so many areas within the volume, and what can happen is you get a much spottier result. Let's set that to 10 and render and see what happens, and there we go, and you can see the sample density is so low that we can see all of the spots where it's the density isn't high enough. So we can use our sample density to definitely speed things up, but we need to be careful about how low we set that. If we set that to 50 and render, it's looking pretty good. You can see it's a little bit noisy and a little bit globby, but it's almost acceptable. So if we set that to say 75 and render, that's looking pretty good. So adjusting the sample density can definitely speed things up, but be careful, because putting that too low, not only will it result in splodges, but it can result in some flickering when you render an animation. The other thing we can do is we can increase the threshold. We can set that up fairly high, and this is, you know, a way to speed up renders just because the error threshold is higher. It really depends on the detail in your model and the lighting setup, but threshold will basically reduce the accuracy of the samples. So the higher it is, the lower the accuracy. The lower the number, the higher the accuracy. So just by adjusting the sample density and the threshold, and let's enable fast evaluation as well, and all of these things will speed up our rendering. And this is rendering so fast that we're not really seeing much difference, but you know, on some scenes that are taking up to minutes to render, then these values, fine-tuning these can make a big difference. Okay, so let's say we're going to leave it like this. It's starting to look quite candle-like. I think with these lights are a little bit bright. Let's select both of these and set them to just be 80 rather than 100. And there we go. You can see that's looking a little bit nicer. It's not blowing out quite so much at the top. Coming back to our candle wax subsurface scattering, what I want to show you now under the shader tab is a really cool feature called path length. If we fold this down, you can see that we have individual parameters for our red, green and blue lights, and this is the distance that they travel within the surface. So in other words, we can change the distance. So if we want this to get warmer as the light travels through, we want the red light to travel further. So what we can do is we can increase the amount of distance that the red light travels. So this is set to a path length of 5, but if we set this red to 300, and let's render now, look what happens. You see you get this really nice red glow at the longer path lengths. And if we just add in a little bit of green, say, into there, so it's like starting to look pretty nice. Yeah. There we go. So it's definitely looking more like wax already. I think it's looking pretty good so far for the subsurface effect. We're currently using multiple subsurface scattering. So what that means is that when the light hits the surface of the object, it kind of scatters around inside. So it enters the object and it scatters around. The other option we have is single, and single works quite differently in that once it hits the surface, it travels in a straight line. So single is really useful for really accurate definition. If you had something like a pattern in the shader slot here, you will find that when you use single, you will get a really nice clear definition of that pattern. Whereas if you use the multiple option, what will happen is that it will kind of blur and diffuse that a lot more, so it'll become more soft and foggy. So single definitely has its advantages, but it's not really appropriate for this object. The other thing that we have is advanced. You probably won't find the need to change these values. Fresnel reflectivity simulates a Fresnel effect within the subsurface scattering. So if you've got some overlapping parts on your object, say somewhere like here, and you're seeing like a grey line, you can increase this Fresnel reflectivity and hopefully it will get rid of that. It simulates the kind of Fresnel effect inside. Dithering is useful if you start to see banding. It will just add a little bit of noise and help break that up. And the index of refraction doesn't really do that much, to be honest. It just tends to make it either slightly lighter if you lower that, or a little bit darker if you increase it. You probably won't need to change that. We also have a lights tab in here, and we can then decide whether or not we want the GI to contribute to the subsurface effect, which is a pretty cool feature. But if you don't want to have the GI contributing, uncheck that and it will probably speed up your results. And we can also include or exclude lights, which is really handy. So you may want to, you may have a lot of lights in your scene with your candle, and you only really want to include these 2 lights as far as your subsurface scattering effect. And let's come back out of here anyway now and come back to our basic tab. Let's enable diffusion, because of course the candle itself isn't this really perfect pure surface. It's going to be broken up with, you know, bits of debris inside, dust. The wax is going to be slightly different densities and things like that. So we really want to simulate that on the surface and also inside. So if we enable diffusion, we can actually set this to affect the luminance as well. For something like this, I think just using a very simple noise is going to be an ample effect. So let's choose texture, add in some noise, and let's open that up. Now I really want this to be quite subtle, so it's almost like just breaking up the effect, breaking up the surface very, very slightly. And you can see down here on the preview, it's far from doing that at the moment. The noise type I'm going to use is displaced Voronoi, and I'm going to reduce the number of octaves down to about 2, so it's fairly simple. I'm also going to scale this right down to, say, 5. And the next thing I'm going to do is just bring this high clip down, so we're just going to reduce the amount of sort of pieces there. And you can see we just end up with this kind of dotty pattern. You can actually right click on here and choose open window, and if we open this and pull this out, and we can have a look at the effect that noise will have. It has to calculate that. Eventually it will. And there you go. If we render to just see what that looks like on the actual material, there you go. And you can see that it's, you know, it's a bit too heavy-handed. It's too dominant at the moment, but it's the right kind of feeling. So let's just select that, switch to diffuse channel, and let's just bring that down, probably down to about 40 maybe. Maybe even a little bit lower than that. Let's say 30. You can still see the effect of the diffusion, and it's just adding that noise in there. Pretty subtle, but the accumulation of all of these effects is what makes that material work at the end of the day. Under the basic tab, enable bump. Let's come back to diffusion, grab this noise and drop that onto the bump channel. Let's open up this noise. I'm going to take this high clip all the way back to 100. Let's scale this up a little bit. And let's reduce the contrast down. Maybe a bit more, so -50. So it becomes kind of quite flat. But that's a really nice texture for the bump on the candle. I think if we come back and drop this into a layer shader, let's just add in another layer of noise on top. This time I'm going to choose dense. Reduce the number of octaves down to maybe 1, maybe a bit higher, 1.5. Let's bring up that low clip. And let's bring that high clip down. Not quite that much. Just trying to isolate these dots. I think we need to set that a bit lower. Let's set the global scale down to about 5. Maybe a bit lower, 3. And I actually want to invert those values, so we could swap the colors, or we could just come back here and we can right click in the layer shader, and you can actually choose to invert your image there, which is pretty handy. So let's invert that, and let's set this to overlay and bring the opacity of that right down to about 50. So now we've got our Voronoi underneath, which is quite flat, and then we've got these black speckles which will add slightly deeper dents into the bump channel. Let's come up to the root of the bump channel, and I'm going to reduce that down to about 10, I think. Now let's render and have a look. Okay, and you can just see the effect of that here, and it's probably a little bit too much actually. Let's come back in. Let's choose, just add a color shader, drop that at the bottom. I'm going to make that 50%, so it's just grey, and we can then drop the opacity down of these. So that grey shines through. Now if we render, that bump should be a little bit more subtle. There we go. Again, very subtle, but it's working quite well. We don't have any specular on here. No, we do have specular in fact, but it just doesn't seem very bright. And also a little bit of reflection would probably be a good idea. So for the specular, let's choose a colour that's similar to the colour of the surface. Coloured speculars always look a lot nicer, I think, than pure white. And let's set the width up pretty high, around 70, 75. Let's set the height even higher, up to 90, say. But let's bring that fall off right down. Maybe -20, -28. That should give us a nice sharp specular, which kind of falls off. And there you go, you see, now that looks much nicer. We've got that nice sharp specular there, and it kind of falls off in that nice smooth curve that we've added to it. And you can just see some effect of that over here as well. And if we come to the basic tab and add in some reflection, oh my goodness me, it looks totally different. But of course that's at 100%. Now the thing is I've got a sky object in here with an HDR on it, so this is going to show the reflection, and you can really see the effect of that bump on there now, and it's pretty full on, to be honest, and we could probably reduce that down. But we're not going to see that much reflection, otherwise it's not going to look very candle-like, and it's taking a long time to calculate. Let's switch to the reflection channel, and I'm going to bring this down really low to say 10. And I'm also going to add some blurriness. Now this is going to slow things down, and you're not hardly going to see it, so we can get away with using really low samples, say 4 maybe. You could even go as low as 32 here, and I'm going to go for 64, and I'm going to set my accuracy down to about 20. And that's going to speed everything up considerably rather than using the default values. So again, the reflection is fairly subtle. You can't really see it, but if we did a before and after, you would see the result of that. Okay, I think the wax is looking pretty good, so perhaps I should come up and just save my project. One thing we haven't considered so far is the illumination model, and by default that's set to Blinn, and I think for this probably Oronea is more suitable. I'm going to increase the diffuse level. Let's set that to say 250. That's maybe a bit too high, but let's pull that fall off down. There we go, and let's render now. So you can see where the light is hitting it, it's very bright, but it falls off. There we go. And I think changing that illumination model has changed it considerably. I don't think it's looking quite as nice here where the specular is. So I'm going to come back to my specular and let's just take that fall off back up to about 20. And maybe add a small amount of inner width, like just 2 or 3%. And let's just try that. I really like to see those speculars. And I think the other thing is the bump. The bump is looking too heavy. The noise is too large. I think we could come into that bump channel. We could take that down to about 5. We can open this up. Let's come in here. Let's set that maybe to 15. Let's come up to the dense and let's set that to maybe 1.5. And let's try a render again. And you can see that rendering is obviously an important part of creating material, so you do need the renders to be as quick as possible, so it's a good idea to try and optimize it. See, now I've done that, I think the bump is too small, so I think maybe the dents need to come up to 2.5. Let's come back to the other noise and set that to 20, so we're kind of in between where we were before. Let's have a look. And you can only really see this clearly around the top here where the specular is hitting, and I think that's looking pretty good. Okay, so obviously we could keep going with this, and if we had a specific candle that we wanted it to look like, it would probably help, but hopefully that's given you guys a good example of how you could use subsurface scattering to create this type of material. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create 2 more materials, one for the wick itself, and then we're going to create a flame, and we're going to create the flame purely procedurally, which is fairly unusual and probably not necessarily the route that you would pick in a production. Let's do the wick first of all. Let's just drop this onto the wick object. So the wick object is not particularly accurate wick. If it was a real job, I probably would have done a better job of modeling this, but I think it serves its purpose for this tutorial. And it's basically like a circle wrapped around all of these helixes. So I basically created some helixes and then used a spline wrap to wrap them around this spline, and I think there are 4 in total. And I offset them all by 90 degrees so that they are all rotating at different angles, and you get this nice effect. And then we'll just sweep that along with a circle. You need to be a little bit careful because you can create a lot of geometry if you're not careful. So the circle itself is set to natural with 1, which is why we don't get many polygons all the way around. If I set that back to adaptive 5, which is what it defaults to, you can see that suddenly we've got like millions of polygons that we really don't need, so we can just leave that at 1. It reduces the amount of polygons in that tiny little wick by probably 1,000 or so. Okay. Because we're applying the wick material to a sweep, the UVs are set up for us, and with a sweep we have our U and our V direction, and one of them goes around the profile, so it would be going around the circle, and the other one travels along the length. So if we just switch to our color channel of that material, let's just add in a gradient first of all. Let's come back to our editor camera, and there you go, and you can see that that gradient is traveling around. So if we come in here and we set this to 2dV, you can now see that it's traveling along the length of our sweep. So that's a good start. I'm going to choose to invert those knots. Let's pull this black point down, and let's pull this white point up. We do want a little bit of a transition here, but we don't want that transition to be quite so smooth. We want to break that up a bit. So let's add in some turbulence, something like so. Let's select the wick and just come up and render the active object. Okay, and you can see, hopefully you can see at the top here, we have a bit of a problem with the turbulence. So what we can do to fix that, if we come back to our gradient shader, if we uncheck cycle, then that turbulence will disappear, because it's basically, what it means is it won't tile that gradient. If we leave that checked, then that white is going to start again at this end. And that's why we get to see the turbulence effect here. If we uncheck that, that black will just carry on and that white will just carry on. So if you want to tile your gradients, you need to leave cycle enabled. But if you don't want to tile them, then you uncheck it. I don't think white's the right colour. Let's fold this down, select this, and let's just make this a little bit more of a kind of light brown beigey colour. Okay, come up to the root. Let's choose to copy that. Switch to the basic tab and let's enable luminance, and let's paste that gradient into the luminance channel. If we click on this to open it up, it actually hasn't copied the gradient. Okay, let's just drag and drop that across. And there we go. That's what we want. Now we definitely don't want this to be glowing beige at the base like it will be now, so we need to take this colour and bring this right down almost to like black, but just that tiny little bit of luminance will maybe give the illusion of some of the light, a bit like subsurface scattering in a way within the actual wick itself. But the important part here, I think, is to add in some highlights at the end. Now these highlights will act as if there's a glow at the end. Highlight's probably not the right word. And we just want to add this right at the very end here, and it's pretty tricky to manipulate the knots on a gradient when it's like this. What I tend to do in situations like that is just click on here to bring up a new attribute manager, and then you can drag this right across the whole width of your screen. And now we've got a lot more room for adding in those knots. So what I want to do first of all is just come to the end and let's add in one that is not quite pure white. I don't think it needs to be yellow, but like almost pure white, just somewhere around here. And you can see that we've got like a really light cream. Next I'm just going to add in progressively a few more and slowly take it towards red and then into the black. So the next one, we just want to bring the hue across, take the color up towards orange, something like so. Let's just add another. This time we bring it much more towards red, bring the color right over, and I'm squashing these up so it's a fairly small gradient. Let's add in one more here, and we want that to be right across at the red and kind of getting a bit darker now, maybe even a little bit more, but it's really saturated, and this is the end of that part. If we look at the preview up here, you can see the result, but the turbulence is much too high, so I'm going to bring that right down, maybe to about 5 for this. If we close this now, you can see that we've got this glowing part on the end of our wick, and because we're using a sweep, it hasn't actually put it on the caps, so you could just make like a material and drop that on and apply it just to the caps. Let's just carry on with this material for now. We can come back to that in a moment. Back at the root of the material, you can see the preview here doesn't really represent what we're modeling, so sometimes it's a good idea to come in here and change it, and you've got all these different options. So I'm just going to choose cylinder, and you can right click and you can rotate that in here, and you can see that, and you can see that now we've got that bit at the end. It is a bit like a glowing ember on the end of the wick. Let's switch to the basic tab. Let's enable some bump. It's a pretty small object, so we're not going to see this bump very much, but it just will add a tiny amount of detail to it. So I'm going to use noise for this, and I'm going to set the bump to be really low, about 5. Let's open up this noise, set the space to UV2D, let's set the global scale to 50, and we'll set the relative scale to 50 on X, 500 on Y, and 50 on Z. And you can see that what we've basically done is stretch that noise along Y. If we come back up, you can see the kind of result of that there. Now the specular definitely needs work, and believe it or not, you still get a bit of a specular highlight even on the wick. Let's switch to the specular channel, and if I just come back to Chrome, you can see on this candle here that we've got a little bit of a specular highlight on there, and you can also see that on here. So we do need to adjust that, and at the moment it's just much too wide and too flat really, so we need to again just bring that width down, maybe to about 20. Let's just maybe even reduce the height of it, and let's just reduce the fall off a small amount. So you're just getting these little thin highlights, and if we just render the active object, there you go, you can see that wick. So it's looking a little bit too glossy, and one of the reasons for that is obviously the illumination model, and that should definitely be set to Oranea for this. And let's set that roughness right up to 200 and bring that diffuse level down a little bit so it's a bit duller. I think that specular is still, I don't think we need that fall off. Let's just take that back up a little bit, bring the height down, make it a tiny bit wider. Finally, I'm going to just add some diffusion, and for this I'm just going to keep it really simple and add in some noise. The type of noise, let's just use FBM and just scale that up a little bit. And we really don't want to set that at 100, we just want that to be fairly subtle, so set that around maybe 15 or perhaps maybe 20. Okay. For the ends of this, we probably don't need to worry about it, to be honest, but we can just create a quick material, and let's just enable luminance only. And in the luminance, let's come back to our candle wick, luminance. Let's just copy that gradient, come back to our new material, paste that in. And what I want to do here is just drag these points off, and I'm going to set this to 2D circular. Let's pull these out, and this is let me undo, this is where you need to stretch it out. Okay, there we go. And what we're going to need to do here, of course, is invert this gradient. So I'm just going to right click and choose invert, and there we go. And probably not even sure if we want to go to black at the edges. Okay. So let's call this wick ends. If we drag this onto our sweep, and then we can set a selection for this, and if we put C1, you can see that it just adds it onto the caps only, and you can use C1 and C2 on any kind of NURBS object, and they're like hidden selection sets. So now when we come in, we have our gradient. Okay, let's come back to our normal camera, and let's render and have a look at the wick. It's going to look a little bit odd because there is obviously no flame. And there we go, and you can see the end light glowing. It's not looking too bad. The final part to make is the flame itself, so let's create a new material. Candle flame. And we're going to create some geometry for this, so I'm going to use a simple polygon. I'm going to set this to be -Z. I'm going to set the height to be, say, 65, and sorry, the width to 65, and the height to 100. Let's just pull this up and have a look and see how that fits. Okay, so that's perhaps a bit big. Let's just scale that down. Okay, so we've got a width of 52 and a height of 80. Now I'm going to set the segments here to be, say, 12. Let's just have a look at this with edges, and there we go. And you can see that we've basically got quite a few segments on there. And I'm going to call this flame. Grab this new material and drop that on. It's not looking very convincing at the moment. Doesn't look like a flame. Now the thing is with this is that really you would probably be better off using you know, some kind of fluid engine to maybe create this, or perhaps even just grabbing some real footage of a flame and like tracking it into your shot, or if you're, you know, you could just use the After Effects Exchange, put a null there, and then just drop it on in comp, in Nuke or After Effects or whatever you use for your comp. But I thought it'd be interesting to see how far we can take the material system in Cinema 4D, and whether we can make a flame in here, and you know how convincing it can actually be. So we're going to build it in here instead, just for the hell of it. So let's select this flame. I'm going to right click and choose plane as my view type, because this is flat, and we're basically going to be creating a flat, like an alpha mapped version of a flame, just as you would if you were tracking in a real piece of footage. Switch to the basic tab, and let's disable both the color and the specular channels, and let's enable luminance. We don't want the candle to be affected by any of our lights. We also don't really want our candle to receive or cast shadows, so that's something we need to bear in mind. And because we're using the luminance channel, we're going to create a nice bright material. And it would be a good idea to actually maybe save a matte out for this, so you can add some glow and stuff in comp. Before we create the material for this, let's just jump back to the browser and have a look at these candles and see what's going on. So really they're starting at, you know, like a kind of red through orange, yellow to pure white all the way through, and then we've got the yellow, orange, red again at the bottom. And if we just look at a few, you can see that's a pretty common theme. Again, you can see that here. And perhaps not so much with this. It's got a little bit of a star filter on there, and this one isn't quite so saturated. But yeah, you get the idea. So what we could do is we could take one of these, and we could actually just use that as the source for our colors, and then we can kind of fine tune those colors once we pick them. So let's come back to Cinema, and I'm going to choose, under the luminance channel, I'm going to add in a gradient, and let's open this gradient up, and I'm going to set that to 2D V. Okay, and I'm going to just create a new attribute manager. Don't really want it to be quite that big anymore, and bring this across. Now if I just hide the main window, I can see my photo. So now what I'm going to do is let's just grab this white and pull it across, add another one, let's pull that across. We don't want this black, and I'm going to just start right at this end, and I'm going to pick a color, and you can either use Cinema 4D's built-in color picker, which allows you to pick from the screen, or I'm using OS 10, so I'm going to pick from the screen with this. I'm going to come up here and pick this kind of deep red orangey color, something like so. Maybe make it a bit more saturated, and click OK. And then I'm going to just repeat that process and pick 4 or 5 colors from this candle, something like there. Let's just bring that up a tiny bit, and again let's pick one of these. Maybe, see, I'm kind of customizing them as I do it. I think this one can be a little bit more towards yellow, this one could maybe be a little bit more saturated, a little bit lighter, and then maybe one more just here, and let's just pick one more. I think that should just be something like so. Okay, that'll probably do. And just slide all these knots down. What would be really cool now is if we could literally just copy these and put them at the other end, but unfortunately you can't. You can right click and like double knots, which is pretty handy, but there's no easy way of reversing those. You can reverse all of them by choosing invert. You can choose to distribute them and things like that. But what we need to do is just take all of these and put them at the other end. I think I'm going to make that one a little bit redder. So what you can do is hold down Control and drag, and it will create a duplicate for you. So let's just do that for each one. Not quite as quick as selecting them all and copy and pasting, but still does the trick. I'm not exactly sure whereabouts these need to be. We need to jump back into Cinema, and we can now see it on our flame. It's not actually updating though, is it? There we go. Okay. Still not looking much like a flame though, is it? Let's just render that and make sure. No, it's definitely not looking like a flame. And we can see these there's a bit of banding on there. We could actually see that in the photograph, but I think that's to do with the photography rather than the actual flame itself. Probably just need to spread these out a tiny bit, just so that transition is a little bit smoother. And it's to do with the hue as well. It's not perfect. Okay, I'm not going to tweak these too much because that's something that you guys can do. And you just want to get that hue and that transition between those colours as nice and smooth as possible. So what we need to do now is to create the right shape. We can right click on here and choose to copy this gradient, or another thing is we can just save it as a preset. So let's just call this flame. Okay, and then when we go load preset, you can load that in, and there's flame, you see. There's a couple in there that I've already got. Let's come back up and let's drop this into the good old layer shader, and you can see that I use layer shaders a lot, and that's just because it's like working in Photoshop but within the material system, so it gives you loads of power. And I'm going to choose shader gradient. Let's open this up, and we can either paste that in or we could load preset. I'm just going to paste it in, and I'm going to set this to be 2D circular. And what we want to do is pull all of these knots off at this end, and now we want to pull these across. So we're basically creating a circle in here, like so. That looks pretty good. Could maybe be a little bit bigger, but I think that'll do. And let's come up, and then let's choose multiply. Okay, so now you can see the effect that we've got. So we've got one gradient running one way, and we've got this one running the other way. The problem is that I do need to make this a little bit smaller, I think. Just because the colours going upwards aren't really showing in this. Let's just have a look now. Okay, that's not too bad. And let's come back into this one, and let's just pull all of these up a bit. And we could even add like a blue colour on some of the flames. You see they're a bit blue at the base, but let's just leave it like this. Okay, and pull this one down a tiny bit. It'd be great if we could select loads of knots at once. Okay, there we go. Now it's still very much the wrong shape, so we need to just reshape that. And luckily we can do that within the layer shader because we have the option to transform any of our layers. We can either add the transform effect and scale and transform all the layers beneath it, or we could add in a folder and then add just this top gradient in. Let's just do it the easy way first of all. So we choose effect, transform. Let's see if we transform the whole thing, if it's going to work. So what I want to do is make it thinner and longer. So I want to increase it on Y. So I'm going to set that to say 1.5. And I want to make it thinner. So let's set that to say 0.8. Let's come over here and set that to 0.8. It's Z. It doesn't really actually go anywhere in Z. It just feels a bit more correct to do that. So you can see that the transformation is not happening from the center. It's happening from this top corner up here. So we need to then add some move into this to counteract that. And what we can do is just scrub these values. Thing is, as you scrub them, you don't get a real-time update. So you have to kind of click and see what's happening. So we probably want to set that about 0.17. And we just want to minus this and nudge it across. And if you look in here, because we've got a non-square shape, it's stretched it even more. That's pretty handy. So I'm going to set that to minus 0.106, that turns out, but I don't know if that's dead in the set. It needs to go a bit more, I think. Whoop. About minus 0.11. Let's go with that. That's looking pretty good. Okay, so it's still not looking like a flame, but it's starting to look like a flame. But not really. Okay. Next thing is we need some transparency on this. Obviously, we don't want it to look like a square. We want to have some alpha around the edge of it. So let's come to the basic channel and let's choose to enable the alpha channel. Let's come to our luminance. Grab this layer and let's just drop that onto the alpha channel. Now we're not going to use the alpha that's embedded into the image because we're using the layer shader. It doesn't actually have an alpha embedded into the image, so we need to uncheck image alpha. Now it's just using the luminance values from here to determine the alpha. So what we want to do is turn this to black and white. We want this outside area to be black, and then we want this middle area to be white. And we've already got all of these gradients and everything set up, so it shouldn't actually be too tricky. I think, to be honest, we don't even need this bottom gradient, so let's just delete that. Let's set that to normal and open that up. Of course, we don't need all these colors, so let's just pull all of these off and let's select this last one and make that black. And there we go, and you can see the result there. So if we just render that active object, and there we go, and you can see that we're starting to get like a flame effect. And depending on how much of this red and yellow you want to see, you need to like push the black across like so, and that will trim that off. Or if you take the white across, then obviously that's going to show more of it. I think it was pretty good where it was, somewhere around there. Maybe the white needs to go across just a tiny bit more. There we go. Okay, so that's not looking too bad. But if you remember from the pictures that we looked at, this part here is, kind of see-through. And again, that bit's transparent. Again, this bit here is transparent. On here, you can actually see a little bit of blue color, which would be nice. And again, we've got that transparent part. So we need to add in a kind of transparent part at the bottom here. Before we do that, however, let's just grab this flame and drop it into our candle hierarchy. And what I'd like to do is to just deform this a little bit. So I'm going to hold down Shift and come up and add in a freeform deformer. Okay, and it adds that. If we hold down Shift, it adds it as a child and it makes it exactly the right size, which is a new feature in release 15. But I actually want to make it a bit bigger. So I'm going to just say, set that to about 5. Let's set the width to be maybe a little bit bigger and the height to be a little bit bigger too, because I think an FFD works a little bit better if it's not exactly snuggled up to the points, if it's just slightly bigger than those. And by using the FFD, we can shape this so it looks a little bit more like a flame. So I'm going to set grid points X to 2, Y I'm going to leave at 3, and then Z I'm going to set to 2. If we switch to points mode and bring up our live select, we can grab these, and now if we scale those in, we get a nice point. And then if we grab these, we scale these in, we get that kind of candle flame shape. There you go. See, it's looking more like a candle. Okay, cool. So now we need to just make this transparent area at the bottom. Now there are a few ways of doing this. If we select our material, come to the alpha, open this up, what we could do is we could take this gradient, invert it so that it's black, and then multiply it over the top here. But the problem with this is we need to transform it to, we could make it quite small, but we need to use transform to move it down. And when you transform things, I'll just show you here, they tile, so you get duplicates of them. So that wouldn't really work. But there's another way that we can do it, and we can use the proximal shader. And proximal allows you to take the input of an object, it could be the object axes or it could be the vertices, and it will then generate a gradient around that point. You can use that for loads of really cool techniques, especially if you use it with things like particles. We can use it to kind of create the transparent part on the bottom of here. And what I'm going to do is select my flame, hold down the Alt key, and let's add in a subdivision surfaces hypernerbs, and let's call this flame SDS. If we just switch the display to be quick shading, I'm going to switch to model tool and axis, and let's just pull this down so somewhere around here. fact, let's come to the editor cam and come in and have a closer look. And that probably looks about right, actually. Whoops. So let's switch off our axis mode and grab this and just pull this down so it's somewhere around here, because we want that transparent part be just around the wick, and we probably want our candle to just sit in front of that wick, but let's just leave it in the center at the moment. Okay, come back to our main camera. So in the alpha of this material, open this up, let's choose shader, add in effects and proximal. If we open this up, you can see we've got this big area here for dragging objects in. I'm going to drag this object in like so, and it's going to use that as the source. And you can drag more than one object in, and as I say, you can drag particles in there, etc. Now this square up here is representing our UV space, and this is the size of the circle that it's going to create. So we really want that to be smaller, so let's set that to be around 30. Something like so. But of course, at the moment, if we come up, you can see that this is this layer set to normal. It's creating a white gradient, so that's suddenly becoming our alpha. And if we look now, this is the flame that we've got. So it's not exactly working very well. You can see that it's actually basing that on the position of this flame SDS. Now what we really need this to be is to be the inversion of that, to invert that so that this is black and this is white, and then we need to multiply it. So let's right click on here and choose invert image, and we can choose multiply, and now we have our hole. It doesn't matter that it's in the middle there, because it's not based on that point, it's based on where this object is. So you could have that object passing through it, and as the object passes through, it will then pass that piece of transparency through. So now if we render our flame, there you go, you can see the result, and it's actually looking a bit small, isn't it? So let's come in here and let's set the start distance to be, say, 15, and the end distance to be 50. Let's render that flame and have a look now. Okay, there we go, so that's too much. So let's set that down to 10. That's the only drawback with using this, is that you can't see the result until you render it. Okay, I'm going to set that start distance to 0, actually. 0 to 40, maybe increase that to maybe 5. There we go. It's looking a little bit hard. Let's just render the whole thing. Have a look. Okay, there we go, and it's kind of working actually. Maybe if we just grab our camera and let's set that to be -25, so we're down a little bit lower. Now let's render. Okay, and that's looking pretty good. It's slightly transparent. I don't really want to see through that flame. I don't think the flames are, I think they're fairly opaque. So I think in proximal here, we probably should set that start distance back down to 0, the end at 30. Now let's have a quick look again. And the other thing is, I think that the candle behind it is a little bit too bright, so you can't see the bottom of the flame very clearly, but that's kind of working. Let's select this candle and come to the illumination tab. Let's set that diffuse level down to about 200, maybe even 150. And let's render it again. There we go, you see. So now that's just made a very subtle difference. You can see the whole of the flame. So of course, you know, it's not the most realistic looking flame, but for certain situations it might be perfect for what you need. There's a few things that we can definitely do to make this a little bit more convincing, especially if you're going to be doing animation. One of the things, we could add in some displacement. So let's select the flame, hold down shift and come up, add in a displacer, and I'm going to place this after the FFD. Now what we really want to do is to add some fall off onto this displacer, so that the most displacement is kind of happening as it travels up and it gets less displaced further up, or maybe it would be the other way around. For the displacement, I'm going to use noise, so switch to the shading tab, and in here we can just add regular noise. Let's open that up, And what I'd like to do here is scale this up. So I'm going to set this to be 250. Let's come to our camera, have a look. And there you go. And you can see that you can see the effect that that's having. Let's select this displacer and pull it up. There it is. And then I'm going to just come to fall off and set that to spherical. We need the kind of the center of this, the axis to be around the wick or around the bottom of the flame, and we need to just scale this down a little bit, something like so. Let's make that fall off like so. So basically the majority of the displacement is happening here, but we need to invert that so the displacement is happening as we go up the flame. If we switch to the Object tab, I'm going to set the direction to actually be spherical rather than vertex normal. So it's pushing out from the axis of the displacer. Let's just press play. Okay, nothing's happening at the moment. And the reason for that is because I haven't animated the noise. So I'm going to come into my noise shader. And I want to set it to evolve, but I also want it to set it to kind of move upwards. So I'm going to set the animation speed to be 1. Okay, there we go, and you can see the effect that's having. And because it's spherical, it kind of pushes it up and down. It gives it that, like I'm a flame kind of look. And the other thing that we can do is we can animate the noise moving up. So we've got X, Y, and Z. Let's set this to be minus 0.5. And let's set the speed down here to be, say, 2. And there we go. Now it's got a kind of flicker that's moving up. There we go. So that's just going to add to the effect. And the other thing that we could do is we could kind of have our light at the very top, this casting the shadow. We could just have that moving around very, very slightly so that it, as the flame flickers, the shadow moves. And that will help to sell the effect as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the top light, choose tags, Cinema 4D tags. I'm just going to add in a vibrate tag. Come down to this, enable position. And I think I'm going to set the amplitude to be pretty low on X and Z and have it move up and down as well. So as the kind of flame gets longer and shorter, the light was going to move up and down as well. And they won't necessarily be linked to each other. You could probably do that if you wanted to, but to be honest, I don't think you need to. I think that it would just sell the effect anyway. So I'm going to set that to 5, 10, and 5. I'm going to set the frequency to 1, so it's not too fast. And if we switch to our side view and just press play now, there you go, and you can see that light kind of hovering around, and we've got the flame flickering a small amount. One other thing that we could do is we could come to our material here. If we switch to the luminance tab, we could fluctuate our subsurface scattering a tiny amount, so we just have it so that it gets slightly lighter and darker, so that as the candle gets brighter, the luminance increases. And again, you could do this through like displacer. You could link the texture in here, and you could use this texture, or you could sample from it and maybe use that to control the position of the light, and also you could use that to maybe control the subsurface scattering with a little bit of espresso and stuff. Don't really think you need to, though. I think that we can just get away with just sort of fluctuating this up and down. And there's actually a shader that we can use that's sort of ideal for this. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drop this into a layer shader, and I open this up, and I'm going to come to the shader menu, come down to MoGraph and add in a beat shader. Now the beat shader's pretty cool because it basically will create a beat, and not in an audio sense, but it creates a beat between black and white. If we open it up, you can see that we have this graph, and this kind of represents a heartbeat. I'm just going to leave it like this, to be honest. I'm just going to maybe make that bit a little bit less harsh, and maybe just pull that in. And what we can do is we can use this and multiply it over the top. And at the top here we've got the number of beats per minute, so I want it to be fairly slow, so I'm going to set that to 40. So basically it's going to go kind of like from black to white, you know, up and down. You could draw more of a random graph if you wanted to. And if we come back here and we set this to multiply, that's going to multiply over the top of our subsurface effect. And we really don't want that to be adding black over the top of it at any point. We just want it to be really subtle levels of grey. So we probably want to pull this layer opacity right down, maybe around somewhere around 20, like so. And you probably won't see the result of this. We need to render, but hopefully that will really sell the effect. So the flame itself shouldn't cast a shadow, so we need to just select that object, choose tag, Cinema 4D tags, add a compositing tag, and just uncheck cast shadows, receive shadows, so that we don't have any shadows cast from our flame onto the candle from the light above. Other than that, I think we've reached the end. So I'm going to render out an animation of this so we can have a look at the final result. Okay, here's the render. If I just kind of scrub through, you can see that we've got the shadow moving, the flame flickering, the subsurface scattering, kind of pulsing a small amount. If I just press play, got a little bit of flicker in here where I didn't have my settings quite high enough, but generally I think it's definitely starting to go in the right direction, and there's a lot of scope to improve this, but hopefully that gives you guys the impetus to take this even further. And obviously this is a candle, it's a bit of an obvious execution for this waxy material, but this will make a beautiful material for typography and things like that. So I hope you enjoyed this class, and thanks for watching.